This briefing features an AI-generated digital twin of Isaac Dangana, technical lead at Red Alert Labs, produced with his consent to improve delivery, setting, and production quality. The analysis, script, and expertise are Isaac's and Red Alert Labs. We hope you enjoy it.
Hello, and thank you for taking 16 minutes with me. I am the digital twin of Isaac Dangana, who is the technical lead at Red Alert Labs. In this briefing, I want to explain what CRA Article 14 changes for manufacturers of connected products. On the 11th of September 2026, Article 14 of the Cyber Resilience Act enters into application. From that date, if you manufacture a product with digital elements for the EU market, you are expected to detect actively exploited vulnerabilities and severe incidents, assess them, report them within defined windows, notify users when needed, coordinate with suppliers, and deliver corrective updates. I want to be precise about what that means because it is easy to misread. This is not a policy you write once and file away. It is an operational capability you have to be able to execute under time pressure on the day it happens. This briefing is for product security leads, compliance owners, engineering managers, and the executives who will have to sign off on how their organization handles Article 14. You do not need to be a lawyer to follow it. You do need to understand the shape of the obligation well enough to prepare for it. In the next 15 minutes, I will cover three things: what Article 14 requires, where manufacturers most often stall, and what you can do before the obligation applies. Let us start with the obligation itself. Article 14 requires manufacturers of products with digital elements to report two categories of events: an actively exploited vulnerability in your product and a severe incident that has an impact on the security of your product. The word that matters most in that sentence is actively exploited. This is the single point I want you to hold on to because it separates the events that start the clock from the events that do not. The trigger is not that a CVE identifier exists. It is not that a researcher has published a proof of concept. It is not that a component you integrate has a known weakness. The trigger is active exploitation of a vulnerability in your product in the wild against deployed systems. A CVE assigned to a third-party library you use does not, on its own, start your reporting clock. The question you have to answer for each signal is narrower and more practical. Is this being exploited right now against products that are out in the field? Before I get to the deadlines, one word on who this applies to, because the scope is broad. Article 14 applies to manufacturers of products with digital elements placed on the EU market. That covers hardware with digital components, software products, and products that process data. And it covers both consumer and professional products. If you are established outside the EU but you place products on the EU market, the same obligations apply to you. So the question is not whether you are a European company, the question is whether your product reaches the European market. Once that condition is met, three deadlines apply. The first is the early warning. Within 24 hours of confirmed awareness, you submit an early notification. The type of notification, the product, a title, and an initial classification. The second is the detailed notification. Within 72 hours of confirmed awareness, you submit your initial assessment, the nature of the vulnerability or incident, and the corrective measures you have taken or plan to take. The third is the final report, and here the timing depends on which track you are on. For an actively exploited vulnerability, the final report is due within 14 days of the date a corrective measure becomes available. For a severe incident, it is due within 1 month of the 72-hour detailed notification. If both a vulnerability and a severe incident apply to the same event, both tracks run, and the earlier deadline governs your timing. All of these go to one place: the ENISA Single Reporting Platform, the SRP. The SRP is a centralized electronic system managed by ENISA. You file once, and the platform routes your notification to the national CSERT for your main EU establishment and shares it across the EU as appropriate. So a single submission satisfies the routing obligation. ENISA has stated that registration instructions and training materials will be published during 2026, and when they are, we will reflect them in our materials. So that is the shape of the obligation. One trigger, active exploitation or a severe incident, and then three deadlines, all filed through one platform. It is a clear structure. Where it gets difficult is in the judgment calls, and that is what I want to turn to next. In our work with manufacturers preparing for this, the same points come up again and again. I will walk through 5 of them. For each one, I will state the mistake and then the correction. The first is treating every CVE as reportable. Teams see a vulnerability identifier attached to something in their product and assume the clock has started. It has not. As I said a moment ago, the obligation is tied to active exploitation, not to the existence of an identifier. If you report every CVE, you will overwhelm your own team and the platform, and you will still miss the ones that matter. The correction is to run a structured triage on each signal and decide on evidence whether exploitation is actually occurring. The second is misreading what aware means and using that to delay the clock. The clock starts at the moment any person in your organization or any automated system you operate has reliable evidence that a vulnerability in your product is being actively exploited. Awareness is assessed objectively. If the information reached your organization, you are considered aware from the time it arrived, whether or not someone opened the alert. You cannot pause the clock by not looking. The correction is to make sure incoming signals reach a person who can act on them quickly because the 24 hours is already running. The third is assuming that a vulnerability in a third-party component is the supplier's problem to report, not yours. It is both. If a component you integrated is being actively exploited in your product, you have an independent reporting obligation, regardless of whether the component's vendor also reports. Your obligation is based on the exploitation happening in your product, not on who wrote the vulnerable code. You notify the supplier in parallel, but you do not wait for their response before you file your early warning. The correction is to treat the supplier notification and your own SRP filing as two separate tracks that run at the same time. The fourth is misreading the 14-day final report deadline for vulnerabilities. Teams sometimes panic that they must produce a patch within 14 days of becoming aware. That is not what it says. The 14 days run from the date a corrective measure becomes available, not from the date of awareness. If your patch takes longer to develop, the final report clock for the vulnerability track starts when the patch is ready. In the meantime, you develop and communicate interim mitigations to your users, and you reference those measures in your 72-hour detailed notification. The correction is to separate the two clocks in your mind. The notification clocks run from awareness, the vulnerability final report runs from remediation. The fifth is waiting until an incident happens to figure out the SRP. When you're inside a 24-hour window, that is the worst possible time to be creating accounts, confirming who your national C-cert is, and working out who is authorized to submit on your behalf. The correction is to complete every preparation step you can now before the platform is under pressure and before you are. There is one more point that sits underneath all 5, and it is about the quality of your evidence. When you triage a signal, not all evidence carries the same weight. Some of it is direct. The vulnerability is listed as actively exploited in a recognized catalog, or your own logs show payloads matching the exact execution path, or you have confirmed unauthorized access on deployed devices. Any one of those on its own is enough to establish reasonable certainty and start the clock. Other evidence is indirect. A credible third party tells you exploitation is happening, or a component vendor states it in an advisory. That kind of evidence supports your assessment, but on its own, it should prompt you to escalate and confirm, not to sit and wait. Knowing which kind of evidence you are looking at is what lets you act quickly without acting recklessly. These 5 and the point about evidence are not exotic. They are ordinary, and that is exactly why they catch people. The good news is that all of them are addressed by preparation you can do in advance, and I will come to that. But first, I want to show you what it looks like when the preparation is in place. Let me walk you through a realistic event, start to finish. This is the worked example from our readiness pack. The company is fictional, but the sequence is exactly what a prepared response looks like. The manufacturer is Midco, based in Berlin. Their product is SecureDoor Pro, a smart building access controller with embedded firmware and cloud connectivity. It has a fleet of about 1,400 units across Germany, France, and the Netherlands. Their designated national C-cert, because their main establishment is in Berlin, is the German authority, the BSI. The product integrates a third-party TLS library called OpenConnect. Day 0, 1432 UTC. A national C-cert issues an advisory. The version of OpenConnect that Midco uses contains a remotely exploitable authentication bypass. It has a CVE assigned, and there is confirmed exploitation in the wild. Notice what Midco does not do. They do not start the clock the moment the advisory lands. The advisory is the trigger to begin triage, not the start of the deadline. Their product security lead opens the triage checklist and checks the vulnerability against the public databases. The lookup confirms it is listed as actively exploited. That confirmation is what establishes reasonable certainty. The clock starts at 14:45, about 13 minutes after the advisory arrived, and that timestamp goes into the evidence log. By 1510, they have cross-referenced their software bill of materials and confirmed that only SecureDoor Pro is affected. Two other product lines use a different library and are out of scope. By 1530, they have worked through the decision tree and confirmed the reporting obligation is triggered, and they have opened the supplier notification track in parallel. At 1615, the early warning is submitted to the SRP. The platform routes it to the BSI and to ENISA at the same time and returns a reference number. From the clock starting to the early warning being filed, 90 minutes well inside the 24-hour window. 15 minutes later, they send a formal notification to the component security team using the contact address the supplier published. The story does not stop there, and this is where the two tracks I mentioned earlier become concrete. The next morning, the supplier responds, a patch is in development, expected within a few days, and no interim mitigation is available from them. So Midco's own engineering team replicates the authentication bypass in a lab, confirms the attack path, and builds a temporary network-level workaround they can give customers now without waiting for the upstream fix. That workaround is what goes into the 72-hour detailed notification as the corrective measure in progress. And because the vulnerability track final report runs from the date a corrective measure becomes available, the 14-day clock for the full report does not even begin until the patch is actually ready. Every step, every timestamp, every decision goes into the evidence log as it happens, not reconstructed afterward. That is the whole point of preparation. When the triage checklist, the decision tree, and the ownership are all defined in advance, a live event is calm and procedural. 90 minutes, not 90 hours of panic. The pressure is absorbed by the structure, not by the people. So what should you do between now and the 11th of September? I will give you 3 concrete actions. First, define and sign off 2 documents, your triage checklist and your responsibility matrix. The triage checklist is how your team decides in the first 2 hours of a signal whether the clock has to start. The responsibility matrix, the RACI, assigns every action in your response to a named role, so nobody is asking who owns this while the clock is running. These 2 documents determine whether you respond correctly in the first 2 hours of an event, and everything else depends on them being accurate. Have them reviewed and formally signed off by your legal counsel and the executive responsible for CRA compliance. Second or third, prepare your SRP registration now. Identify your designated national C-cert, which is determined by your main establishment in the EU. Decide who in your organization is authorized to submit on your behalf, and settle that question in advance. Because if you use an external security partner for monitoring and triage, the responsibility for the submission still sits with you as the manufacturer. Confirm those roles now and complete every preparation step available ahead of the platform opening fully. Do not leave any of this to the day of an event. Third, do not build all of these from a blank page. We have published a readiness pack for exactly this. It contains the triage checklist, the decision tree, the 4-phase response workflow, the responsibility matrix, the notification templates, the SRP preparation steps, and the worked example I just walked through. It is designed to be your operating manual for an Article 14 event, not a summary of the regulation. And if you want a structured view of where your organization stands against these obligations, our team runs a CRA readiness assessment that maps your current posture against Article 14 and identifies exactly what to close before September. You will find the details at the end of this briefing. Let me leave you with the three things that matter most. One, the trigger is active exploitation, not the existence of a CVE. Two, the clock starts when your organization has reliable evidence. 24 hours for the early warning, 72 for the detailed notification, and the final report on the track that applies. 3. The difference between a calm 90-minute response and a crisis is preparation you do now, not on the day. To help with that, register to receive our CRA Article 14 Readiness Pack. It gives you the checklists, templates, and workflows to operationalize everything I have covered today. And if you would like our team to assess your readiness directly, reach out about a CRA Readiness Assessment. Thank you for your time. I look forward to helping you be ready.
Red Alert Labs hopes you have enjoyed this briefing.